The Trespassers' Dawn. The morning sun hadn't yet crested the horizon when Jacob Harrow jolted awake to a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the usual chorus of crickets or the lowing of his cattle stirring in their pens. It wasn't the wind rattling the old oak trees that dotted his sprawling ranch or the distant bark of a coyote prowling the hills. No, this was something foreign, something invasive, a clamor of voices, laughter, and the unmistakable clatter of metal stakes being driven into the earth. Jake sat up in bed, the worn quilt sliding off his chest as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. His bedroom window faced east, overlooking the heart of Harrow Ranch, a 200-acre stretch of rolling fields, dense woods, and a pond his grandfather had dug by hand decades ago. He squinted into the pre-dawn gloom, his ears straining to make sense of the noise. It sounded like a crowd, a big one, right on his doorstep. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the hardwood floor cold against his bare feet, and shuffled to the window. What he saw made his stomach lurch. Down the hill, where his pasture met the dirt road that marked the edge of his property, a swarm of strangers milled about like ants on a kicked-over hill. Tents were popping up in haphazard clusters, their bright nylon colors clashing with the muted greens and browns of his land. Smoke curled into the air from a half-dozen bonfires, and the faint glow of lanterns bobbed as people moved between them. A group of teenagers darted past his barn, their silhouettes clutching cans that glinted in the dim light. Beer, no doubt. Near the pond, a couple of families spread picnic blankets, their kids already splashing in the shallow water, shrieking with delight. Jake's grip tightened on the windowsill, his knuckles whitening. This wasn't a random gathering. This was an invasion, his land, his sanctuary, overrun by people who had no business being there. He counted at least 100 of them, maybe more, setting up camp like they owned the place. And at the center of it all, standing on a folding chair like some self-proclaimed monarch, was a woman he recognized instantly, Lydia Voss. Lydia was the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, a suburban enclave that sprawled just beyond the northern boundary of Jake's ranch. She was a petite woman with a sharp bob haircut and a penchant for pastel blazers, but her presence loomed larger than life. She waved her arms dramatically, directing people with the confidence of a conductor leading an orchestra. Even from this distance, Jake could see the smug curve of her lips, that infuriating smile she wore whenever she got her way, which, in her mind, was always. He turned from the window, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache, and grabbed the flannel shirt draped over the back of a chair. He didn't bother with socks, just yanked on his boots, the leather creaking as he laced them up. His coffee pot sat cold on the counter, but he filled a mug anyway, the bitter brew from last night sloshing into the ceramic. He needed something to steady his hands, something to keep him from storming down there and losing his temper before he had a plan. Stepping onto the porch, he leaned against the railing, the mug warm against his palms as he surveyed the chaos below. The air carried the scent of smoke and damp grass, mingled with the faint tang of spilled beer. A man in a garish floral shirt and sunglasses, despite the early hour, stumbled past the barn, tipping his can in Jake's direction with a sloppy grin. "Hey man, great spot you got here. Lydia really hooked us up." Jake's eyebrows shot up, his grip on the mug tightening until he thought it might crack. "Hooked you up?" he muttered under his breath, the words dripping with disbelief. He took a sip of the cold coffee, letting it burn down his throat as he watched Lydia flit from group to group, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. She was in her element, basking in the attention, oblivious, or indifferent, to the fact that she'd turned his land into her personal playground. He set the mug down on the railing with a deliberate thunk and started down the dirt path that wound through his property. His boots crunched against the gravel, each step fueling the slow simmer of anger building in his chest. As he approached the campsite, heads turned, conversations faltering. A woman folding a blanket near the pond glanced up, her expression shifting from curiosity to unease. A teenage boy with a beer can froze mid-sip, his eyes darting to Lydia as if she'd shield him from whatever was coming. Lydia noticed him then, spinning on her heel with a theatrical flourish. "Oh, Jake," she called, her voice bright and syrupy, the kind of tone she used when she wanted to smooth over a problem she'd caused. "Don't be so grumpy. It's just one night." Jake stopped a few yards away, folding his arms across his chest. The morning air was cool, but he could feel the heat rising in his face. "Who said you could be here, Lydia?" he asked, keeping his voice low and steady, though the edge in it was sharp enough to cut. She laughed, a high, tinkling sound that grated on his nerves, and waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, come on, Jake. The community needed a little getaway, and your land is just sitting here, doing nothing. Wasted potential, really." She tilted her head, that smug smile widening as if she'd just paid him a compliment. "Wasted potential," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. He took a step closer, the dirt crunching under his boots. "This land's been in my family for 3 generations. Every fence post, every tree, every damn blade of grass. I've worked it, my father worked it, his father before him. And you think it's yours to use because it's sitting here?" Lydia sighed, a long, exaggerated breath that suggested he was the one being unreasonable. "It's not a big deal, Jake. I made a post in the neighborhood group. Everyone was so excited about camping out here. Fresh air, a little nature, what's the harm?" She gestured around, her manicured nails catching the first rays of sunlight creeping over the hills. Jake's gaze followed her hand, taking in the mess already forming. Beer cans littered the ground near a bonfire that crackled too close to his barn. A man in cargo shorts was hammering a tent stake into the roots of an oak tree Jake's grandfather had planted 60 years ago. Kids splashed in the pond, kicking up mud that would take weeks to settle. "What's the harm?" he echoed, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "And what part of that post included my permission?" She laughed again, louder this time, as if he'd said something absurd. "Oh, Jake, don't be so possessive. It's just land. And anyway, everyone's already here. What do you want me to do? Send them all home?" She spread her arms wide, drawing the attention of a few nearby campers who paused to listen, murmuring among themselves. "Yes," he said flatly. "That's exactly what I want." For a split second, something flickered in Lydia's eyes, irritation, maybe even doubt, but she buried it fast. She tilted her chin up, her tone sliding into that patronizing lilt she'd perfected over years of HOA meetings. "Look, it's just one night. Don't be such a stick in the mud. We'll be gone by morning, and no harm done." Jake's gaze swept the scene again, the litter, the smoke, the tent stakes sinking deeper into his tree's roots. "No harm done," he said, his patience fraying like a worn rope. Lydia rolled her eyes, a dramatic huff escaping her lips. "Ugh, you're being so dramatic. The HOA board fully supports community events like this." He smirked, a slow, bitter curve of his lips. "That's funny, Lydia, because my land isn't part of your HOA." Her face twitched, just for a moment, a crack in her armor, a hint of realization that she might have miscalculated. But Lydia Voss didn't back down, not ever. She huffed again, brushing off his words like they were dust on her blazer. "Oh, technicalities," she said, waving a hand. "It's all about the spirit of the community, right? Lighten up, Jake. It's not like you even use this land for anything important. What's the harm in sharing it for one night?" He let her words hang in the air, the silence stretching long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. His eyes scanned the chaotic sprawl of tents and bonfires, the trespassers who'd turned his home into their party ground. And then, slowly, an idea took root. A plan, sharp and deliberate, sparking behind his steady gaze. "Fine," he said at last, stepping back. A grin crept across his face, slow and dangerous. "Stay as long as you want." Lydia blinked, clearly thrown off by his sudden shift. "Wait, really?" He nodded, the smirk deepening. "Sure, but I hope you and your guests are early risers." She frowned, her brow furrowing as she tried to read him. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake didn't answer. He just turned, picking up his mug from where he'd left it on a stump, and started back up the path toward his house. Behind him, Lydia's voice rang out, triumphant. "See, everyone? No problem at all. Let the camping begin." The crowd cheered, oblivious to the storm brewing in Jake's mind. He took a sip of his coffee, the cold bitterness grounding him as he climbed the hill. They wanted to camp on his land. Fine. Let them enjoy their night. Because come sunrise, they'd meet the real owners of this field, his bulls, restless and ready to reclaim what was theirs. Jake Harrow stood on his porch, the evening shadows stretching long across the ranch as the last light bled from the sky. His coffee mug sat empty beside him, the cold dregs staining the ceramic. Down the hill, the invaders had turned his land into a circus. The faint crackle of bonfires mingled with the thump of music, a cheap speaker blasting some pop song he didn't recognize, and every few minutes, a burst of drunken laughter or a loud whoop pierced the air. It was the kind of noise that set his teeth on edge, an intrusion as tangible as the trespassers themselves. He leaned against the railing, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disgust and grim anticipation. Lydia Voss had wasted no time claiming her victory. She flitted between the clusters of tents, her pastel blazer swapped for a fleece vest that screamed outdoors as chic, though Jake doubted she'd ever spent a night under the stars before this. She sipped wine from a plastic cup, her laughter ringing out as she regaled a group of campers with some story, her hands waving like she was conducting a symphony of chaos. The campers, emboldened by her confidence, had made themselves at home. A group of men in their 30s, floral shirts and cargo shorts their uniform, had taken it upon themselves to borrow firewood. Jake's eyes narrowed as he watched them yank posts from the fence that bordered his pasture, the wood splintering with each tug. That fence had stood for 20 years, built by his hands and his father's, and now it lay in a pitiful heap, feeding their bonfires. He clenched his jaw but stayed silent. Let them dig their hole deeper. Near the barn, a couple of teenagers kicked a soccer ball, their shouts echoing off the weathered wood. One of them, too drunk or too stupid to care, relieved himself against the wall, the dark stain spreading across the planks Jake had painted last spring. He felt a twitch in his fist, the urge to march down there and knock some sense into the kid, but he held back. Patience, he told himself. Sunrise would settle the score. By the pond, a family had set up a grill, the greasy smoke wafting up as they flipped burgers dangerously close to the barn's dry timbers. Jake's gut tightened. If he hadn't been watching, if he'd gone to bed trusting them to behave, he might have woken to a smoldering ruin. A woman in a sun hat called out to her kids splashing in the water, their muddy feet churning the once clear pond into a murky soup. "Be careful, sweetie," she yelled, oblivious to the fact that they were the ones ruining it. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a calculated takeover, orchestrated by Lydia and executed by a mob too caught up in their getaway to care whose land they were trashing. He'd given them their chance to leave, and they'd laughed in his face. Fine. They'd made their choice. As the night wore on, the energy shifted from rowdy to reckless. A group of guys started a game of beer pong on a folding table, cans clattering to the ground with every missed shot. Someone strung up a hammock between two trees, the ropes digging into the bark. A woman in a tie-dye shirt danced near a bonfire, her shadow flickering as she swayed too close to the flames. Jake watched it all from his perch, cataloging every infraction, every insult to his family's legacy. Each one fueled the plans simmering in his mind. Around 10, Lydia took center stage again. She climbed onto a cooler, wobbling slightly as she raised her wine cup like a toast. "To the best community event Willow Creek has ever seen," she shouted, her voice carrying over the chatter. The crowd cheered, a sloppy, half-hearted roar from people too deep into their drinks to care about the words. "This is what unity looks like," she went on, gesturing grandly at the mess around her. "Fresh air, good company, and a little adventure, thanks to me." Jake snorted, the sound lost in the night air. Unity. Adventure. She'd turned his ranch into a landfill, and she had the gall to call it a gift. He glanced toward the barn, where his bulls shifted restlessly in their pens. He'd checked on them earlier, running a hand over the gate as they snorted and pawed the dirt. They didn't like being cooped up all night, not when they were used to roaming the fields at dawn. Soon, he'd murmured to them, a promise he intended to keep. By midnight, the party began to wind down. The music faded to a low hum, the bonfires dwindled to embers, and the campers started stumbling into their tents. A few diehards lingered, their slurred voices carrying fragments of conversation, something about stars and freedom and how they should do this every weekend. Jake's lip curled. Over my dead body, he thought. Lydia was one of the last to turn in. She stood by her oversized tent, a garish purple monstrosity with extra poles and a rainfly she'd probably never needed. Finishing her wine with a satisfied sigh, she caught Jake's eye as he stood silhouetted on the porch, and for a moment, their gazes locked. She raised her cup in a mock salute, that smug grin flashing again, then ducked inside. The zipper rasped shut, and the field fell quiet, save for the snoring tangle of bodies sprawled across his land. Jake stayed on the porch a while longer, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He could have gone inside, climbed into bed, and let the exhaustion of the day pull him under. But sleep wouldn't come, not yet. Not with the weight of what he'd planned pressing against his chest, a mix of anticipation and cold satisfaction. He turned his gaze to the barn, the dark shape looming against the starlit sky. The bulls were waiting, their energy coiled tight, ready to explode. He stepped inside briefly, grabbing a fresh pot of coffee from the kitchen. The machine hissed as it brewed, the rich scent grounding him as he poured a new mug. Back on the porch, he sipped slowly, letting the hours tick by. The night stretched on, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of a tent or a muffled cough from the campsite. He didn't mind the wait. Ranching had taught him patience, the kind that paid off when the timing was just right. At 3 a.m., he walked to the barn, his boots soft against the dirt. The bulls stirred as he approached, their massive forms shifting in the shadows. Red, the lead bull, lifted his head, his eyes glinting in the faint moonlight. He was a beast, 2,000 pounds of muscle and temper, with horns that curved like scythes. Behind him, the others snorted, their hooves kicking up dust. "Easy, boys," Jake said, his voice low and steady. Not long now. He ran a hand over the gate, feeling the solid weight of the latch. It was a simple mechanism, one he'd opened 1,000 times to let the herd out at dawn. Tomorrow, it'd be no different, except for the audience waiting beyond it. He pictured it, the sun breaking over the hills, the first groggy campers stumbling out of their tents, only to find themselves staring down a herd of bulls in full charge. The thought brought a slow grin to his face, sharp and unyielding. Back on the porch, he settled into a rocking chair, the coffee keeping him alert as the sky began to lighten. The stars faded, giving way to a soft gray that crept across the fields. A thick mist rolled in, swirling between the tents like a living thing, softening the edges of the chaos below. It was perfect, almost poetic, the calm before the storm he was about to unleash. He finished his coffee, the mug clinking as he set it down. The horizon glowed faintly, a promise of dawn. It was time. He stood, stretching his arms above his head, and started down the path to the barn. The air was still, the world holding its breath. His land, his rules, and come sunrise, Lydia and her merry band of trespassers would learn that the hard way. The first sliver of sunlight broke over the hills, casting a golden glow across Harrow Ranch. The mist hung low, curling around the tents like ghostly fingers, softening the edges of the campsite sprawled across Jake Harrow's pasture. He stood at the barn, his breath visible in the crisp morning air, one hand resting on the gate that penned his bulls. The herd shifted behind him, their snorts and stomps a restless rhythm that matched the steady thud of his pulse. This was it, the moment he'd waited for all night. He lifted the latch with a single, deliberate motion. The gate creaked open, the sound swallowed by the stillness. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Red stepped forward, his massive frame filling the gap. His head lowered, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air, and behind him, the others stirred, 6 bulls in all, their muscles rippling under thick hides. Jake stepped aside, his boots crunching against the dirt. "Go on," he murmured, and with a snort that rattled the silence, Red bolted. The herd followed, a thunderous wave of power and fury. The ground shook as their hooves pounded the earth, kicking up clods of dirt and tearing through the mist. Jake watched them charge into the open field, their forms half shrouded in the haze, a surreal vision of chaos about to descend. He grabbed his coffee mug from the porch on his way back, strolling down the path with the calm of a man who'd just lit a fuse and was waiting for the bang. The campsite lay oblivious below, a tangle of nylon tents and snoring bodies. The first scream came fast, a man stumbling out of his tent, arms stretched above his head in a lazy yawn. He froze, eyes widening as Red barreled toward him, horns glinting in the dawn light. What the? His yelp cut off as he dove back inside, the tent collapsing around him like a deflated balloon. The fabric thrashed as he scrambled within, his muffled curses drowned by the growing rumble of hooves. Another camper poked his head out of a sleeping bag, blinking groggily at the herd tearing through the field. His brain lagged, stuck between sleep and shock, until Red swung his head low, snorting a warning. The man shot up like he'd been electrocuted, tripped over his own feet, and face-planted into a pile of empty beer cans. The clatter woke others, and within seconds, the camp erupted into pandemonium. Screams split the air as tents folded in on themselves, their owners clawing free in blind panic. A woman in a nightgown sprinted toward the pond, her slippers sinking into the mud as she shrieked, "Bulls! Bulls!" A teenage boy, still clutching a beer can, bolted for the trees, only to trip over a cooler and sprawl across the dirt. Coolers tipped, spilling ice and soda. Folding chairs flew as people kicked them aside in their rush to escape. A speaker blared on, kicked by a passing bull, spinning across the ground like a tumbleweed pumping out distorted pop beats. Jake leaned against a fence post, or what was left of it after last night's firewood raid, and sipped his coffee, the warmth steadying him as he watched the chaos unfold. The bulls wove through the campsite, more curious than aggressive, though their sheer size was threat enough. Red trotted past a bonfire's smoldering remains, scattering ash with a flick of his tail. Another bull, a stocky black beast named Titan, nosed a tent, collapsing it with a dull whump as the occupants screamed inside. Lydia emerged then, stumbling out of her purple monstrosity of a tent, her hair a wild tangle, her robe slipping off one shoulder. She blinked at the scene, her brain struggling to catch up. What is happening?" she screeched, her voice cracking as Titan lumbered past, snorting loudly. She jumped back, arms flailing, nearly toppling into her own tent. "Jake, what is this?" He took his time strolling over, coffee in hand, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Morning, Lydia," he said, raising the mug in a casual toast. "Sleep well." She spun on him, her face a mask of outrage, eyes blazing through the mess of her hair. "Are you out of your mind? There are bulls everywhere." "Yep," he said, nodding as he took another sip. "Looks like it." Her jaw dropped, then snapped shut, her hands clenching into fists. "You did this on purpose." Jake shrugged, his grin widening just enough to needle her. "Technically, I just let my bulls out to graze. This is their field, after all." He gestured at the chaos, tents trampled, campers fleeing, a man running past with his tent still tangled around his legs like a cape. "You're the ones who decided to camp in the middle of it." "You." Lydia's face turned a deep, furious red, her voice rising to a pitch that could have shattered glass. "You think this is funny? People could get hurt." He tilted his head, pretending to consider it. "Funny, you weren't too worried about safety when they were breaking my fence, swimming in my pond, and setting fires near my barn." He nodded toward the grill still smoldering by the barn, its greasy smoke curling into the air. "Guess we've all got different priorities." Her mouth opened, then closed, words failing her as another bull let out a bellow, sending a group of campers sprinting for their cars. Engines roared to life, tires spinning in the dirt as people peeled out, abandoning whatever they couldn't grab. A woman clung to a tree branch, yelling at her husband below to get the kids and run. A portable toilet tipped over with a crash, a man's muffled curses echoing from inside as he flailed to free himself. Lydia jabbed a finger at Jake's chest, her nails inches from his flannel. "This isn't over, Jake Harrow. I'm calling the HOA board. You'll be hearing from them." He arched an eyebrow, unfazed. "Go right ahead. But I'm pretty sure they don't have jurisdiction over my ranch." She froze, the realization hitting her like a slap. Her hand dropped, her eyes darting as the weight of her mistake sank in. She'd spent the night throwing around her self-proclaimed authority, only to see it crumble now, trampled under the hooves of Jake's bulls. Around her, the campsite dissolved into a battlefield, broken tents, scattered trash, coolers upended. The last stragglers piled into their cars, doors slamming as they sped off, leaving tire tracks in the mud. Lydia spun back to the wreckage, her grand community event reduced to a humiliating rout. She stood there, fists clenched, watching her triumph unravel, and Jake savored every second of it. He took another sip of coffee, the bitter warmth a perfect match for the satisfaction burning in his chest. The bulls slowed their charge, snorting and pawing the ground as the last of the intruders fled. The mist began to lift, the sun climbing higher, and Jake knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not until Lydia faced the full reckoning she'd earned. The dust hadn't even settled when the low rumble of an engine cut through the morning air. Jake Harrow stood amidst the wreckage of the campsite, his coffee mug still warm in his hand, watching as a familiar truck rolled up the dirt road. The bulls had wandered off to graze, their work done, leaving behind a field strewn with trampled tents, scattered trash, and the echoes of fleeing campers. Lydia Voss stood in the center of it all, her robe askew, her face a storm of rage and disbelief as she watched the last car disappear around the bend. Sheriff Daniel Carver stepped out of the truck, his boots kicking up dust as he adjusted his belt. He was a broad man in his 50s, with a weathered face and a dry humor that Jake had always appreciated. They'd known each other since high school, back when Dan's idea of law enforcement was breaking up keg parties by the river. Now, he carried the weight of the badge with a calm authority, though the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth told Jake he was already enjoying this. Lydia spotted him and pounced, practically running over in her muddy slippers. "Sheriff, thank God," she gasped, her voice shrill with desperation. "Arrest this man. He released wild bulls on us. This was a peaceful community event, and he set us up." Dan raised an eyebrow, his gaze sliding from Lydia to Jake, who gave him a small nod. They'd talked last night, just after Jake had watched the fence posts come down and the bonfires flare too close to his barn. He'd called Dan not out of panic, but out of strategy, laying out the situation with the cool precision of a rancher who knew his rights. Dan had listened, chuckled, and promised to swing by at dawn. Now, here he was, unfolding a piece of paper from his pocket with a sigh. "Karen." "Sorry, Lydia," Dan said, his voice steady but firm. "We need to have a talk." She blinked, latching onto his presence like a lifeline. "Yes, thank you. Arrest him immediately." Dan glanced at Jake again, then back to her, his expression unreadable. "First off, let's start with this." He held up the paper, letting it catch the sunlight. "An official trespassing complaint, filed by Jake last night." Lydia's mouth fell open, then snapped shut. "Trespassing?" she choked out, the word dripping with indignation. "That's ridiculous. This land is part of the community." "Is it?" Dan said, tilting his head. "Because according to county records, this ranch belongs to Jake Harrow. Last I checked, your HOA rules don't stretch past Willow Creek's cul-de-sacs." Her face twisted, a flush creeping up her neck. That's preposterous. This was a misunderstanding, a community retreat. Everyone was so excited. Dan wasn't done. He flipped through his notes, his tone staying even but cutting deeper with every word. "Second, we've got property damage reports, broken fences, stolen firewood, damage to the barn, littering." He gestured at the field, where beer cans glinted in the grass and a tent flap fluttered like a surrender flag. "That's all on you, since you organized this little shindig without the owner's consent." Lydia's confidence cracked, her hands trembling as she forced a nervous laugh. "This is just a mix-up. It was supposed to be fun, a little nature getaway. You charged people to come here, didn't you?" Dan interrupted, his eyes narrowing. Her face paled, her bravado crumbling. "What? No. I mean, I may have collected small donations for supplies, but..." "Small donations?" Jake cut in, pulling out his phone. He'd snapped a screenshot of Lydia's social media post last night, before she could scrub it. He turned the screen toward Dan, showing the bold text, $50 entry fee for an exclusive HOA nature getaway. Lydia's eyes widened, her breath catching as Dan let out a slow whistle. "Well, that's interesting," Dan said, folding the paper back into his pocket. "See, Lydia, that makes this a whole different ballgame. Now we're looking at unauthorized event hosting, potential fraud charges, and illegally collecting money on private property." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her brain scrambled for an escape, but the net was tightening. "Now, normally," Dan continued, "a situation like this would mean hefty fines, maybe a trip to the courthouse. But I'm feeling generous today, so I'll make you a deal." Lydia clutched at the lifeline, her voice small. Yes, a deal. That sounds great. You and your HOA buddies are going to pay Jake back for every bit of damage you caused, every fence post, every piece of trash, every scratch on his land. Dan's gaze hardened. And you're never to set foot here again without permission. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting as if searching for a way out. There was none. And if I refuse? She whispered. Dan smiled, a thin, unyielding curve. Then I process these complaints, and you can explain yourself to a judge. Silence stretched, heavy and final. Then, for the first time in her life, Lydia made the smart choice. She nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. Fine, she muttered. I'll pay for the damages. Good, Dan said, tipping his hat. That's what I thought. He turned back to his truck, leaving her standing in the ruins of her grand plan. Lydia spun to face Jake, her eyes burning with humiliation. You think you've won? She hissed, her voice low and venomous. He took a final sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle before flashing her a slow, satisfied grin. I don't think, Lydia. I know. She glared, then stormed toward her car, her shoulders tense with fury. The last campers piled in, desperate to escape, and within minutes, the field was empty, save for the debris and the faint hum of retreating engines. Jake let out a deep breath, the silence washing over him like a balm. The fight was over, and he'd come out on top. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist as Jake Harrow surveyed his land. The campsite was a ghost town now, tents abandoned, trash scattered, tire tracks gouged into the dirt where cars had fled. The bulls grazed peacefully in the distance, their dark shapes blending into the rolling fields. The silence was sweet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past 24 hours, and Jake let it sink in, a quiet victory settling over him. He spent the morning cleaning up, starting with the fence. The posts the campers had stolen lay splintered by the bonfire pits, useless now except as kindling. He hauled new ones from the barn, his muscles straining as he drove them into the ground with a post pounder. The rhythm was familiar, grounding, each thud a reclaiming of what was his. By noon, the fence stood whole again, a sturdy line marking the boundary Lydia had so casually ignored. The pond was next. The water was murky, clouded with mud from splashing kids and spilled drinks. He waded in, boots sinking into the soft bottom as he scooped out beer cans and a soggy picnic blanket. It'd take days for the sediment to settle, but he'd get it clear again. This was his grandfather's pond, his father's pride, and no trespasser was going to leave it ruined. The barn took longer. The grill's grease had stained the wood, and he scrubbed it with a wire brush, the faint scent of charred meat lingering. The wall where the teenager had relieved himself got a fresh coat of paint, the white covering the insult like it had never happened. Step by step, he erased the evidence of Lydia's invasion, restoring order to his world. By late afternoon, he sat on the porch, a cold beer in hand instead of coffee. The field stretched out before him, scarred but reclaiming its peace. He thought about his family, his grandfather's calloused hands digging the pond, his father's quiet lessons on tending the land. This ranch was their legacy, and he'd protected it, just as they'd taught him. The satisfaction ran deep, a quiet pride that didn't need words. Lydia made good on her promise, though not without grumbling. A check arrived the next day, delivered by a sheepish HOA treasurer who avoided Jake's gaze as he handed it over. It covered the fence posts, the paint, even a little extra for inconvenience, as the note scrawled in Lydia's handwriting put it. Jake smirked as he tucked it into his pocket. She'd paid up, but he knew the real cost to her was the humiliation. She'd never live this down. That evening, he pulled out his phone, opening the Willow Creek HOA Facebook group. The comments from Lydia's camping post had been deleted, but the memory lingered in the neighborhood's collective mind. He typed a new message, his fingers steady on the screen. Next time you visit my land, Lydia, bring a tent, preferably one that's bulletproof. He hit post, leaned back in his rocking chair, and watched the likes roll in. Neighbors chimed in with laughing emojis, a few well-played S, and one bold soul tagging Lydia with a bull gif. She didn't respond, probably too busy licking her wounds, but Jake didn't need her to. The point was made. The days that followed were quiet. The bulls roamed as they always had, the pond began to clear, and the ranch settled back into its rhythm. Jake went about his work, feeding the herd, mending a gate, checking the fields. Each task a reminder of why he'd fought. This was his home, his life, and no self-important HOA president could take that from him. Word spread fast in Willow Creek. By the weekend, the story of the Bull Run was local legend, swapped over beers at the tavern and whispered at PDA meetings. Lydia's reign as HOA queen took a hit. Her next meeting saw half the usual turnout, and her motions for new community projects got shot down with knowing smirks. She'd messed with the wrong rancher, and the neighborhood wouldn't let her forget it. Jake didn't gloat, not outwardly. He didn't need to. The land spoke for him, its quiet strength a testament to what he'd defended. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the hills in shades of gold, he stood by the pond, hands in his pockets. The water was almost clear again, the surface catching the light like a mirror. He nodded to himself, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The HOA had learned a lesson they wouldn't soon unlearn: never trespass on a rancher's dawn.